Their plaited beards were long, and their dark hair was bound behind by leather thongs. Both men carried long spears, and the second man also had a sword at his belt, though he had not yet drawn it. I held my breath. The leading man raised a hand, and both men stopped and listened for a while, before coming on again. The nearest man's face was scarred from an old fight. His mouth was open, and I could see the gaps in his yellowed teeth. He looked immensely tough, experienced and frightening, and I was suddenly overwhelmed with a terrible desire to flee. But then the scar on my left palm, the scar that Nimue had put there, throbbed, and that warm pulse gave me a jolt of courage.
"We heard a deer,"
the second man said disparagingly. The two men were advancing at a stealthy walk now, placing their feet carefully and watching the leaves ahead for the smallest flicker of movement.
"We heard a baby,"
the first man insisted. He was 2 paces ahead of the other, who looked to my scared eyes to be even taller and grimmer than his companion.
"Bastards have disappeared,"
the second man said, and I saw the sweat dripping off his face, and I noticed how he gripped and re-gripped his ash spear shaft, and I knew he was nervous. I was saying Bell's name over and over in my head, begging the god for courage, begging him to make me a man. The enemy was 6 paces away now, and still coming, and all around us the green wood lay warm and breathless, and I could smell the 2 men, smell their leather and the lingering scent of their horses as sweat dripped into my eyes, and I almost whimpered aloud in terror. But then Gwilithin leapt out of his ambush and screamed a war cry as he ran forward. I ran with him, and suddenly I was released from fear, as the mad, God-given joy of battle came to me for the very first time. Later, much later, I learned that the joy and the fear are the exact same things, the one merely transformed into the other by action. But on that summer afternoon, I was suddenly elated. May God and his angels forgive me, but that day I discovered the joy that lies in battle, and for a long time afterwards I craved it like a thirsty man seeking water. I ran forward, screaming like Gwilithin, but I was not so crazed as to follow him blindly. I moved over to the right side of the narrow path, so that I could run past him when he struck the closer Silurian. That man tried to parry Gwilithin's spear, but the carpenter expected the low sweep of the ash staff, and raised his own weapon above it as he thrust his weapon home. It all happened so fast. One moment the Silurian was a threatening figure in war gear, then he was gasping and twitching as Gwilithin rammed the heavy spearhead through the leather armour and deep into his chest. And I was already past him, yelling as I swung Howl's sword. At that moment I felt no fear, perhaps because the soul of dead Howl came back from the other world to fill me. For suddenly I knew exactly what I had to do, and my war scream was a cry of triumph. The second man had a heartbeat's more warning than his dying companion, and so he had dropped into a spearman's crouch, from which he could spring forward with killing force. I leapt at him, and as the spear came at me in a bright, sun-touched lunge of steel, I twisted aside and parried with my blade, not so hard as to lose control of the steel, but just enough to slide the man's weapon past my right side as I whirled the sword around. "It's all in the wrists, boy! All in the wrists," I heard Howl say, and I shouted his name as I brought the sword hard down onto the side of the Silurian's neck. It was all so quick, so very quick. The wrist maneuvers the sword, but the arm gives it force, and my arm held Howl's great strength that afternoon. My steel buried itself in the Silurian's neck like an axe biting into rotten wood. At first, so green was I thought he had not died, and I wrenched the sword free to strike at him again. I struck that second time, and was aware of blood brightening the day, and the man falling sideways, and I could hear his choking breath and see his dying effort to pull the spear back for a second thrust. But then his life rattled in his throat, and another great wash of blood ran down his leather-covered chest as he slumped onto the leaf mould. And I stood there shaking. I suddenly wanted to cry. I had no idea what I had done. I had no sense of victory, only of guilt, and I stood shocked and motionless with my sword still embedded in the dead man's throat, on which the first flies were already settling. I could not move. A bird screamed in the high leaves. Then Gwilithon's strong arm was around my shoulders, and tears were streaming down my face. "You're a good man, Derval," Glywithon said, and I turned to him and held him like a child clinging to a father. "Well done," he said again and again. "Well done." He patted me clumsily, until at last I sniffed back my tears. "I'm sorry," I heard myself saying. "Sorry?" He laughed. "For what? Howl always said you were the best he ever trained, and I should have believed him. You're fast. Now come. We have to see what we've won." I took my victim's sword scabbard that was made of willow-stiffened leather, and found it fitted Howl's sword tolerably well. Then we searched the two bodies for what little plunder we could find: an unripe apple, an old coin worn smooth, 2 cloaks, the weapons, some leather thongs, and a bone-handled knife. Gwilithon debated whether we should go back and fetch the 2 horses, then decided we did not have the time. I didn't care. My vision might be blurred by tears, but I was alive, and I had killed a man, and I had defended my king, and suddenly I was deliriously happy as Glywithon led me back to the frightened fugitives and raised my arm as a sign that I had fought well. "You made enough noise, the 2 of you," Morgan snarled. "We'll have half Siluria on our heels soon. Now come, move!" Nimue did not seem interested in my victory, but Lunette wanted to hear all about it, and in the telling I exaggerated both the enemy and the fight. And Lunette's admiration engendered even more exaggeration. She had her arm in mine again, and I glanced at her dark-eyed face and wondered why I'd never really noticed just how beautiful she was. Like Nimue, she had a wedge-shaped face, but where Nimue's was full of a wary knowledge, Lunette's was soft, with a teasing warmth, and her closeness gave me new confidence as we walked on through the long afternoon, until at last we turned east towards the hills, of which Caer Cadern stood like an outrider. 1 hour later, we stood at the edge of the woods that faced Caer Cadern. It was late in the day, but we were in midsummer, and the sun was still high in the sky, and its lovely, gentle light was flooding the western ramparts of Caer Cadern with a green glow. We were a mile away from the fortress, but still close enough to see the yellow palisades atop the ramparts, close enough to see that no guards stood on those walls, and no smoke rose from the small settlement inside. But nor was there any enemy in sight, and that decided Morgan to cross the open land and climb the western path to the king's fortress. Gwilithon argued that we should stay in the forest till nightfall, or else go to the nearby settlement of Lindinis. But Gwilithon was a carpenter, and Morgan a high-born lady, so he surrendered to her wishes. We moved out into the pasture-land, and our shadows stretched long in front of us. The grass had been cropped short by deer or cattle, yet it was soft and lush underfoot. Nimue, who still seemed to be in a pain-haunted trance, slipped off her borrowed shoes and paced barefoot. A hawk sailed overhead, and then a hare, startled by our sudden appearance, sprang out of a grassy hollow and raced nimbly away. We followed a path edged with cornflowers, ox-eyes, ragweed and dogwood. Behind us, shadowed by the sun's western slant, the woods looked dark. We were tired and ragged, but journey's end was in sight, and some among us even appeared cheerful. We were bringing Mordred back to his birthplace, back to Dumnonia's royal hill. But before we were even halfway to that glorious green refuge, the enemy appeared behind us. Gunlius's war band appeared, not just the horsemen who had ridden to Innis Uidrin in the morning, but his spearmen too. Gunlius must have known all along where we would go, and so he had brought his surviving cavalrymen and over 100 spearmen to this sacred place of Dumnonia's kings. And even if he had not been forced to pursue the baby king, then Gunlius would still have come to Caer Cadern, for he wanted nothing less than the crown of Dumnonia, and Caer Cadern was where that crown was bestowed upon the ruler's head. Who held Caer Cadern held Dumnonia, the old saying went, and who held Dumnonia held Britain. The Silurian horsemen spurred ahead of their spearmen. It would take them only a few minutes to reach us, and I knew that none of us, not even the swiftest runners, could reach the long slopes of the fortress before those horsemen swept around us with slashing steel and stabbing spears. I went to Nimue's side, and saw that her thin face was drawn and tired, and her remaining eye bruised and tearful. "Nimue," I said. "It's all right, Derval." She seemed annoyed that I wanted to take care of her. She was mad, I decided. Of all the living who had survived this terrible day, she had survived the worst experience of all, and it had driven her to a place I could neither follow nor understand. "I do love you," I said, trying to touch her soul with tenderness. "Me? Not Lynette?" Nimue said angrily. She was not looking at me, but towards the fortress, while I turned and stared at the approaching horsemen, who had spread into a long line like men intent on flushing game. Their cloaks lay on their horses' rumps, their scabbards hung down beside their dangling boots, and the sun glinted on spear points and lit the banner of the fox. Gunlius rode beneath the banner, the iron helmet with its foxtail crest on his head. Ladwis was beside him, a sword in her hand, while Tanabers, his long robe flapping, rode a grey horse close beside his king. I was going to die, I thought, on the day that I had become a man. That realization seemed very cruel. "Run!" Morgan suddenly shouted. "Run!" I thought she had panicked, and I did not want to obey her, for I thought it would be nobler to stand and die like a man than be cut down from behind as a fugitive. Then I saw she was not panicking, and that Caer Cadern was not deserted after all, but that the gates had opened, and a stream of men was running and riding down the path. The horsemen were dressed like Gunlius's riders, only these men bore the dragon shields of Mordred on their arms. We ran. I dragged Nimue along by the arm, while the handful of Dumnonian horse spurred towards us. There were a dozen riders, not many, but enough to check the advance of Gunlius's men, while behind the horsemen came a band of Dumnonian spearmen. 50 spears, Gluithen said. He had been counting the rescue party. "We can't beat them with 50, he added grimly, "but we might make safety." Gunlius was making the same deduction, and now he led his horsemen in a wide curve that would lead them behind the approaching Dumnonian spearmen. He wanted to cut off our retreat, for once he had assembled his enemies in one place, he could kill us all, whether we numbered 70 or 7. Gunlius had the advantage of numbers, and by coming down from their fortress, the Dumnonians had sacrificed their one advantage of height. The Dumnonian horsemen thundered past us, their horses' hooves cutting great chunks of turf from the lush pasture. These were not the fabled horsemen of Arthur, the armoured men who struck home like thunderbolts, but lightly armed scouts, who would normally dismount before going into battle. But now they formed a protective screen between us and the Silurian spearmen. A moment later, our own spearmen arrived and made their shield wall. That wall gave us all a new confidence, a confidence that veered towards recklessness when we saw who led the rescue party.